The first thing anyone noticed about Crestview Medical Center at night was the quiet. Not silence. Hospitals were never silent, but a particular kind of quiet that settled over the building after 10 when
Listen
the
to me.
daytime machine
We don't have
of
much time.
appointments and
What are you going to
administrators and
do?
purposeful
Save you.
footsteps
Just trust
gave
me.
way to something slower and more honest. The fluorescent lights hummed at a slightly different pitch. The elevator doors opened and closed without anyone waiting. The building breathed differently in the dark, and Cole Merritt had learned to breathe with it. He came through the staff entrance at 9:52, 8 minutes early, the way he always was, signed the logbook with the same pen he kept clipped to his front pocket, and stood for a moment in the narrow corridor that smelled of industrial cleaner and something underneath it, something older and more permanent that no amount of mopping would ever reach. Dave Kowalski was finishing his day shift, a heavy-set man in his 50s who walked like his knees had opinions about it. He handed Cole the incident report clipboard without being asked. Quiet night. Cafeteria AC is still broken. Maintenance says Thursday at the earliest. Dave pulled on his jacket, one arm at a time, the careful movements of a man whose body had started charging interest on old debts. Room 114 had a rough afternoon. Old fella's been asking for water every 20 minutes. Nurses are stretched thin on the east wing. Cole took the clipboard, scanned it, handed it back. I'll check on him. Not your job. Lot of things aren't. Dave looked at him the way people sometimes did, a look that sat somewhere between pity and respect and couldn't quite decide which side to land on. Then he left, and Cole was alone in the corridor with the hum and the smell and the particular weight of a night that hadn't started yet. He went to the cafeteria first, because he always went to the cafeteria first. Lily was at the corner table, the one farthest from the vending machines, because she didn't like the sound they made when they cycled. A detail she had mentioned exactly once 2 years ago, and that Cole had never forgotten. She had her math workbook open in front of her, and she was staring at the window that looked out onto the parking structure, watching the light change on the concrete in a way that suggested she had been doing this for some time, and the math workbook had been a more recent addition to the tableau. When she heard his footsteps, she sat straighter, and her eyes dropped to the page with the slightly over-casual precision of someone who had absolutely been paying attention the whole time. Cole set a paper bag on the table without comment. Inside, half a turkey sandwich on wheat, an apple, a small bag of pretzels. Lily looked at the bag and then at him. You ate? Yes, Dad. Homework. Almost done. Lily. Her mouth did something small and complicated. Mostly done. He sat down across from her. The cafeteria had 4 other people in it, a night shift nurse eating soup from a thermos, 2 orderlies talking near the coffee station with the particular animation of men telling a story they'd told before, and an older woman in civilian clothes who might have been visiting someone or might have simply found a place to sit and hadn't been ready to leave it. Cole looked at his daughter. Lily looked back at him, and he was struck again the way he was struck every few weeks with the force of something that should have become familiar by now but hadn't, by how much she looked like Rebecca. Not a general resemblance. Specific things. The slight asymmetry of her gaze when she was thinking. The way she held still without fidgeting, which was unusual in an 8-year-old and had been unusual in her mother, too. The quality of her attention, which was total when she chose to give it. He looked away first. On his left wrist, below the cuff of his uniform sleeve, the edge of an old tattoo was barely visible. A sequence of numbers and letters in a particular format faded now to the greenish gray of ink that had lived in skin for 15 years. Lily reached across and touched it with one finger, the way she occasionally did, checking to confirm it was still there. Dad, what does it say again? He pulled the sleeve down gently. Lucky numbers, kiddo. Lucky numbers don't look like that. She had said this before in different words, which meant she was still working the problem. She was her mother's daughter in that way, too. They look like a code. Maybe. He stood, and the movement was the answer she was going to get. Get some sleep. I'll check on you at 2. He paused. Finish the homework first. It's one problem. How long have you been on it? The small, complicated thing happened to her mouth again. He kissed the top of her head and left before she could reframe the situation. The hallways were his now, or as much as they ever belonged to anyone. He did the east wing first, the pattern he'd established in the first week on the job, and never changed because predictability was useful in a space like this. People stopped being startled when they knew you were coming. The patients in the rooms he passed through, the gaps in curtains and doorways, were sleeping or watching the ceiling or the particular blank communion with the television that wasn't really watching, just existing in the presence of light and sound. Cole moved through it all at a pace that was unhurried but purposeful, a pace he'd learned in a different context entirely and that had translated across the years and the distance without losing anything essential. He stopped outside room 114. The man inside was named Gerald according to the chart clipped to the door. 71 years old. Prostate cancer stage 3 managed rather than cured, which was a distinction that mattered to the medical staff and probably mattered very differently to Gerald. He had been at Crestview for 11 days. The visitor log, which Cole had not officially been asked to consult but had showed no entries after the third day. A daughter in Phoenix. A son in the military, whereabouts listed as overseas, no more specific than that. Cole got a cup of water from the station down the hall and carried it back. He didn't go in. He set it on the small shelf beside the door where Gerald would see it when he woke, the way Cole had been doing every night for a week and a half. It was not in his job description. It was not nothing either. In the break room at the end of the east corridor, the television on the wall was tuned to a business news channel, with the volume low enough to be almost subliminal. Cole rarely watched it, but he was early for his check-in at the security desk, and he had learned that standing still in an empty room was harder than it had any reason to be. So he stood near the coffee station and let the images wash over him. Nurse Carla Hutchins came in at 7 minutes past 11, still in her scrubs, pulling her hair back with the elastic band in the automatic way of a woman who had done this 10,000 times. She was 43 and had worked the night shift at Crestview for 8 years, which meant she had been here longer than Cole and knew things about the building's rhythms that he was still learning. She saw him looking at the television and looked at it herself. On the screen, a woman in a dark suit was standing at a podium in front of what appeared to be a press gathering. The chyron at the bottom read, "Ashworth Dynamics CEO confirms Crestview Medical Center acquisition timeline." "You see this?" Carla poured coffee without measuring it. "The Ice Queen is buying us." "I saw the notice." "You worried?" "Should I be?" She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "Night security is always first on the cut list, Cole. That's not an opinion, that's accounting." He didn't answer that. He looked at the woman on the screen instead. Diane Ashworth was 36 years old, according to everything the financial press had written about her, which was a considerable amount. She had founded Ashworth Dynamics at 25 with a series of acquisitions in the healthcare technology sector that analysts had called aggressive and that she had apparently called Tuesday. The company was now valued at somewhere north of $4 billion. She had appeared on 3 separate magazine covers in the past 18 months, always in the same posture. Spine-straight expression, composed eyes that suggested the camera was a mild inconvenience she had agreed to tolerate. She was answering a question now, her responses measured and precise, each sentence doing exactly what it needed to do and stopping before it needed to do anything else. No visible uncertainty, no pause to gather thoughts. The suit had no wrinkles. Cole had been around enough people under genuine pressure to know the difference between someone who was performing calm and someone who had simply organized themselves around it, and he could not tell, watching her, which category she occupied. That itself was a kind of answer. "She looks like someone who's never had a bad day," Carla said. Cole watched Diane Ashworth finish her response and step back from the podium with the clean efficiency of someone for whom every physical movement had been considered and found adequate. He thought about Lily at the corner table with her mostly done homework. He thought about the invoice from Lily's school that had arrived last week and that he had paid and not thought too much about, which was its own kind of thinking. "Everyone's had bad days," he said. "Some people are just better at hiding them." The radio on his shoulder crackled. Carla's pager went at the same moment. They both moved. The doors of the emergency bay came open before Cole reached them. Not because he was running, he wasn't, not quite, but because the ambulance had beaten its own siren by seconds and the paramedics were already in motion, the practiced, controlled urgency of people who did this for a living and had learned to make urgency look like competence. The gurney came through fast. Cole registered several things in sequence. Woman mid-30s, evening dress, torn at the shoulder and dark with blood along the right side, face the color of old wax, breathing in the shallow, interrupted rhythm of someone whose body was working very hard at a task it was losing ground on. He recognized her. The whole city would have recognized her. It took him approximately 2 seconds, and then he filed it and moved on because it wasn't the relevant information. Carla was already at the station. Dr. Okafor is still in the OR. He's got another 40 minutes minimum. There's no attending in the ER right now. The overnight physician called out sick, and the replacement is, how long to 12 minutes out, maybe 15. Cole was already beside the gurney. The paramedics looked at his uniform and started to say something, and he was already past them, hands moving, checking pulse at the carotid. Weak, irregular. Breathing pattern suggested compromised lung function on the right side, the kind of compression that came from fractured ribs and the trouble they made for themselves in the aftermath. Carla said, "Cole, you're not—" "I know what I'm doing." He said it without looking at her fingers, already locating the specific geography of injury with the focused attention of someone reading a text he knew well. "Trust me, or she dies. Those are the options." A pause. Then Carla was beside him, asking the right questions, handing him what he needed before he had fully finished asking for it, and that was how it was between people who had been trained to move without hesitation in the presence of catastrophe. They hadn't been trained together. They had been trained in different rooms in different decades for different reasons, and it didn't matter at all. The woman on the gurney opened her eyes. Not all the way. Enough. She looked at him at the security guard's uniform, the Crestview Medical Center patch on the shoulder, the logo that said very clearly that he was not a doctor, not a paramedic, not any category of person whose hands should currently be doing what his hands were doing. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite fear, because fear would have required more energy than she currently had available. Her lips moved. Cole leaned slightly closer. "Please." The word was barely air. "Just make it fast. I don't want the pain." He looked at her directly. Not the way you looked at a patient when you were cataloging vital signs, but the way you looked at a person when you needed them to hear something and believe it. He had done this before in different rooms under different conditions, with different people who had different reasons for being close to an edge they hadn't chosen to stand near. The look was the same. It was one of the things that translated. "Not tonight, ma'am. You're going to see the sunrise. Stay with me." Something happened in her eyes. Not belief exactly, or not only belief. More like the decision to try belief, which was different, and in some ways harder. Her hand moved on the gurney surface, not reaching, just moving, and Cole put his hand where hers was going, and she held on with a grip that was stronger than her breathing had any right to produce. "Don't let go," she said. "I won't." He worked. This was the part that had never left him, not in the years since he'd signed the discharge papers and driven away from the base with Lily asleep in the car seat behind him, not in all the time since then when he'd been things other than what he'd been trained to be. The knowledge lived in his hands. It was not sentimental about its location. It simply was there, and it operated, and he followed it the way water followed low ground, because that was the path it knew. Behind him, someone came through the doors with too much speed and not enough purpose. The stumbling entrance of a person responding to a situation rather than a situation they were prepared for. Cole didn't look. He registered the sound pattern, a man, expensive shoes, the particular breathing of someone who had been moving fast in a climate-controlled car and wasn't used to the transition. Then the sound of a phone camera engaging the tiny mechanical whisper of a shutter that most people didn't notice, but that Cole had trained himself to notice in contexts where being photographed was a thing that happened. He glanced up, just once. A man in a good suit, early 40s, the kind of face that was used to being in the presence of important people and had organized itself accordingly. He was pointing his phone at the gurney. At Cole. The expression on his face was not concern. It was something calculating and procedural, a mind running probabilities on a situation and deciding how it could be made useful. Cole held the man's eyes for 2 seconds. The phone went down. The shutter sound stopped. The man stepped back but didn't leave, which meant he hadn't deleted it, which meant he was holding it the way people held things they intended to use later. Cole returned his full attention to the woman whose hand was in his and whose life was currently the only arithmetic that mattered. Dr. Okafor came through the doors 9 minutes later, still in surgical gloves that he was stripping off as he walked. He was 60, Nigerian-American, with the specific manner of a man who had seen the full spectrum of what human bodies could do to themselves and had made peace with all of it. He looked at the monitors, looked at Cole, looked at the monitors again. "You did this?" "Kept her steady, that's all." The medical team took over with the efficiency of a mechanism that knew its function. Cole stepped back into the space they didn't need, which was what he had always done in the transition from crisis to system. From the moment when one set of hands was all there was to the moment when the institution arrived to do the work institutions were built for. He was good at the transition. He had practiced it. They were moving her toward surgery when she turned her head, looking for him. He was near the wall now, already becoming background, and he was used to that. It was fine, but she found him anyway with the last of the focus she had available, and her lips moved again. 2 words this time. He read them rather than heard them. He nodded once. Then he walked out of the ER and into the hallway and became part of the building again. The East Wing was quiet when he did his second pass. The soup nurse had gone back to her floor. The orderlies were elsewhere. Gerald's light was off in room 114, which meant he was sleeping or trying to, and the water would be there when he woke. Cole walked the long corridor toward the security desk at the center of the building, past the windows that looked out on the parking structure, where the sodium lights made everything the color of old photographs, past the bulletin boards with their layers of announcements and protocols, and the occasional hand-drawn poster for a blood drive or a fundraiser, past the small alcove with the defibrillator mounted on the wall and the laminated instructions that most people walked by every day without reading. He stopped in front of the notice board near the administrative corridor. It had been there for 3 days. He had read it the first day and hadn't needed to read it since, but he stopped in front of it anyway, the way you sometimes stopped in front of things that were already in your head, just to confirm the words hadn't changed. Crestview Medical Center. Operational Transition Notice. Ashworth Dynamics had completed its initial review period and was entering the 60-day due diligence phase prior to acquisition finalization. Staff questions could be directed to Human Resources. The notice was signed by the hospital administrator and had the Ashworth Dynamics logo in the upper right corner, a clean geometric mark that managed to communicate efficiency without communicating anything else at all. Cole looked at it. He thought about the woman in the emergency bay, whose name he had not needed to confirm because her face was on the building's acquisition notice in the context of every piece of business news he'd seen in the past 3 months. He thought about the man with the phone camera. He thought about Lily at her corner table and about the school invoice and about the particular specific fact that night security was always first on the cut list, which was not Carla's opinion, that was accounting. He was not a man who spent much time on things he couldn't change. He had learned this through necessity rather than philosophy, but the result was the same either way. He turned away from the notice board and went back to doing his job. At 2 a.m. he checked the cafeteria. Lily was asleep with her head on her arms, the math workbook pushed to the side with the resigned body language of a problem solved or abandoned. He couldn't tell which without looking at the page. Her breathing was deep and regular. The last pretzel in the bag had been eaten. The apple was gone. She had drawn something in the margin of the workbook's back cover, small figures in ballpoint pen, a man in a boxy uniform, and a woman on something that might have been a gurney or a bed, and between the 2 figures something that appeared to be a heart rendered with the elaborate care of a child who had been thinking about it for some time. Cole sat down across from her. He didn't touch the drawing. He looked at his daughter for a while in the way that was only available to him in these night hours, The looking that didn't have to perform anything, that didn't have to be the father who had it figured out, that could just be a man sitting with something precious and understanding exactly how contingent it all was. His wrist was on the table, the tattoo visible below the sleeve he'd let slip. He thought about the field station that smelled of copper and diesel and the particular quality of light that came through canvas in the afternoon in a desert where he had not expected to spend so much of his life. He thought about the 18 months he had spent across 3 deployments being the person who arrived when the calculation had already gone wrong, when the variables had exceeded their tolerances, and someone needed not a strategist, but hands and training and the specific refusal to leave. He thought about the 23 names on a list that existed only in his head, now men who were alive because he had been in a position to make them that way, and about the one name that wasn't on the list, the one he carried differently, the one he hadn't been fast enough or present enough or something enough to add. He thought about Rebecca. He had been on base when it happened, 1,400 miles away doing his job, which was saving other people's lives, which was the central irony of those years that he had turned over so many times. It was smooth now, worn down to something he could hold without cutting himself. A wet road, black ice that nobody had named yet. The car had gone off the overpass at a speed that the accident report had recorded as consistent with the posted limit, which meant she had done nothing wrong, which was the part that had taken longest to find a place for. He had driven away from the base 6 months later with Lily asleep in the car seat. She had been 3. She didn't remember the base. She had grown up here in this city with this cafeteria and this corner table, and she would tell people when they asked that her dad worked at the hospital, and she would say it with a straightforward pride that sometimes required Cole to find something to look at in another direction. He took his jacket off and folded it and put it over her shoulders. She didn't wake up. At 5:40 in the morning, with the shift entering its final hour and the sky outside beginning to make the first gray-purple suggestions of the day's arrival, Cole was near the end of his last round when he heard the click of designer heels on the polished floor of the main corridor. Hospitals at this hour had a specific acoustic quality. The footsteps of the night staff had the practiced absorption of people who moved carefully in spaces where others slept. These footsteps were different, deliberate, not careful. The sound of someone accustomed to having their arrival register. He turned a corner and nearly walked into Preston. The man from the emergency bay. The phone cameraman. He was in a fresh suit now, or a different suit. It was hard to say, and he had the look of someone who had not slept, but had used the night hours productively. He stepped back, looked at Cole with the particular blankness of someone filing information away. "I was just looking for," he started, and then something shifted in his expression, a decision made. "You're the security guard from last night." "I work here." "Right." Preston's eyes moved over Cole's uniform with a quality that was not quite disrespect, more like the assessment a person made when they were determining what category of problem something represented. "I'm Preston. I'm Miss Ashworth's executive assistant. She's been asking about the staff who were present during her admission." The medical team handled her admission. Of course, the agreement came too smoothly. "I was just making sure I had everyone accounted for." Cole looked at the man for a moment. He had known men like Preston in other contexts, men who were good at being useful to people with power, who had developed the specific skill of reading rooms and managing information and keeping their own position secure by being indispensable to someone who was more visible than they were. It was a legitimate skill. It required a certain intelligence and a certain set of choices about how to apply that intelligence, and Cole had no particular objection to it in the abstract. He also knew that the phone had not been deleted. "You'll want to coordinate with hospital administration," Cole said. "Patient privacy protocols. They can tell you what they're able to share." Preston's smile was brief and professional. "Of course, thank you." He moved past, and Cole listened to the sound of his footsteps, the purposeful click of someone who had what he needed and was deciding when to use it. At 6 in the morning the day shift arrived in overlapping waves, and Cole signed out at the same desk where he had signed in 8 hours earlier. The logbook. The pen. Dave Kowalski was somewhere in the building beginning his own circuit. The cafeteria was busier now, the breakfast crowd, and Lily was awake and had relocated to a chair that allowed her to see the doors, the habit she had developed for watching for him. When she saw him, she made a face that was trying not to be relieved, which meant she had been worried, which meant she had been awake longer than she was letting on. He sat down across from her. She pushed her math workbook toward him. The problem, it turned out, had been solved. He looked at it and then at her. Good. He stood. Let's go. They walked out through the main entrance into the morning that was cold and pale and exactly as promised. The parking structure was half empty at this hour. The spaces around them opened up, and their footsteps on the concrete had a slight echo that Lily always pretended not to notice she was listening to. She had her backpack over both shoulders, and the jacket he'd put over her hours ago was tied around her waist, now the sleeves dangling. She stopped walking. Cole stopped beside her. On the hospital's exterior notice board, the one visible from the front entrance, and that faced the street, a new addition had appeared overnight. The same Ashworth Dynamics logo. A larger version of the acquisition announcement formatted for public display. Alongside it, a photograph Diane Ashworth in the same dark suit from the press conference, the same composed expression looking somewhere slightly past the camera, with the self-possession of someone who had long ago made peace with being looked at. Lily stared at the photograph with the focused attention she normally reserved for things she was still working out. Dad? She said it the way she said things when she was assembling a question from pieces she wasn't sure fit together yet. Is she a good person? Cole looked at the photograph. He thought about the emergency bay, the hand in his, the choice that had been made this morning in the administrative corridors before the day shift arrived, or not made, which was its own kind of choice. He thought about the man with the phone. I think she's trying to figure that out herself. Lily processed this with the gravity that 8 years old sometimes produced when it was paying attention. That seems really lonely. Cole looked at his daughter. He thought about how lonely it was to be someone who made decisions the way Diane Ashworth appeared to make them from behind the glass of a control that was indistinguishable from invulnerability until the moment it wasn't. He thought about how lonely it was to be someone who knew exactly what he was worth and couldn't make the world agree with him. He thought about Rebecca, who had been neither of these things and had been lonely in her own way, the loneliness of someone who loved a man who was always being needed somewhere else. He picked up Lily's backpack strap and straightened it on her shoulder without being asked. Come on, let's go home. They walked to the car. The morning was getting lighter. The hospital stood behind them, already fully in business, already moving through the 10,000 small tasks of keeping people alive that would occupy it until dark, and then through the dark again. Somewhere in the building on the top floor in a private room, a woman was looking at a window and seeing for the first time since the previous night the particular quality of early light that meant the worst of the dark had passed. Cole drove home. He made Lily breakfast, which she protested she didn't need, and ate completely. He checked her school bag for the items that needed to be there and added one that didn't, a small first aid kit. A habit he'd started when she was 5 and hadn't been able to talk himself out of since. He drove her to school, and he watched her walk through the doors with the rolling backpack and the efficient pace of a child who took her arrival places seriously, and then he sat in the parking lot for 2 minutes doing nothing, which was the closest he got to prayer. He drove home. He was asleep within 15 minutes, the practiced collapse of a body that had learned to take what rest was available when it was available. Somewhere in the city in the hospital he had just left, a 60-day clock was ticking, and a man named Preston was looking at a video on his phone, deciding what it was worth. The 30 days that followed were not quiet. They had the surface texture of quiet Cole's shifts, ran their usual patterns, the East Wing, the cafeteria, the slow geography of a building that had learned to expect him. But underneath that surface, something had shifted in the way a foundation shifts invisibly in the period before the crack appears in the wall. The Ashworth Dynamics consultants arrived in the second week, 3 of them, with matching laptop bags and the particular energy of people whose job was to look at a living thing and translate it into a spreadsheet. They moved through the corridors with clipboards and the polite impenetrability of people who had learned to do their work without engaging with what their work meant to the people around them. Cole watched them the way he watched everything steadily without making it visible that he was watching. The staff talked. Night shift people always talked. It was one of the functions of working the hours when administrators were home and the institutional performance could relax slightly, and what they said in the break room and the supply corridors and the nurses' station at the end of the East Wing was a version of what they all already knew. Non-essential personnel were the first line in a restructuring budget. Night security was non-essential by definition because the definition of essential had been written by people who measured things in revenue per square foot and patient throughput and billable hours, and none of those metrics had a line item for the man who brought water to room 114 or covered a child with his jacket at 2 in the morning. Lily asked once directly the way she did things when she'd been thinking about them long enough that the thinking had become uncomfortable. They were in the car the school pickup run, and she had been quiet the whole walk from the building to the parking lot, which was how he knew something was coming. "Are they going to fire you, Dad?" "Haven't decided yet." "What happens if they do?" "We figure it out. We always do." He kept his eyes on the road. The traffic was ordinary. "That's what we do." Lily looked at him with the unnerving directness she had inherited from her mother, the look that did not grant the comfortable interpretations. "You sound more sure than you look." He didn't answer that. He was aware of his hand on the wheel and the slight additional tension in it, and he moved it to his leg instead, and then he was aware of the tattoo below the cuff, and he pulled the sleeve down a 1/4 inch. The reflex older than he could track it back to the habit of reducing the visible surface, making less of himself available to be read. Lily watched this happen without saying anything about it. She was 8 years old and she noticed everything, and chose very carefully what to do with what she noticed, which was the most unnerving of all the ways she was her mother's daughter. The gala announcement came in the 3rd week. The Ashworth Foundation's annual charity event relocated this year to Crestview's main conference hall and event space, a decision that had been framed as a celebration of the hospital's community role and that was additionally a very efficient piece of staging. Diane Ashworth would speak. There would be press. The acquisition would be in the background of every photograph taken that evening, which was not an accident. Cole was assigned to the event security detail by his supervisor without comment, which was how assignments were made, and he accepted it without comment, which was how he accepted things. The night of the gala arrived cold and clear, the kind of November evening that made the city's lights look sharper and more deliberate than usual. Cole was in the main hall by 7 an hour before the guests arrived, walking the space methodically, locating the exits, the blind spots, the places where the crowd would compress and where it would open, the specific geometry of a large room full of people who did not expect anything to go wrong. He had done this kind of assessment in spaces where everything going wrong was a live probability, and doing it here produced a particular quality of dissociation, the way a surgeon feels making a grocery list, the tools. The same, the stakes, entirely different. He found his position near the back wall, the spot with the widest sight line to both the main entrance and the stage, and settled into it with the stillness of someone who had learned that visible stillness made you invisible. He was part of the room's furniture. He was the man by the wall. The guests arrived in the escalating wave of a formal event. The early arrivals who were either very punctual or very eager. The mid-wave crowd that constituted the social mass of the thing, the late arrivals who had calculated their entrance time with varying degrees of self-awareness. Cole watched it all and registered it the way he registered everything, as information, as pattern, as the ongoing assessment of a space and its contents. Then Diane Ashworth came in and the room changed. Not dramatically, not in the way of a movie entrance, in the way of a pressure change, subtle and physical, the way a room recalibrates around a specific gravity. She was in a midnight blue dress, floor length, and she moved through the space with the unhurried authority of someone who had never needed to hurry because the room had always been willing to wait. Her hair was up. Her expression was composed in the precise way it was always composed, a composure that Cole recognized, now having looked at it from close range, as something that had been constructed rather than arrived at naturally the way a bridge was constructed to bear specific loads under specific conditions. She did not see him. He was furniture. He was fine with that. The program ran its expected course. Welcome remarks from the hospital administrator, whose voice carried the slight strain of a man performing ease in front of an audience that included the person who was in the process of buying his building. A video presentation about Crestview's community impact. Doctors and board members cycling through the space of acknowledgement. Then Diane Ashworth walked to the podium, and the room produced the particular quality of attention that was different from quiet, a leaning in and alignment of focus. "Tonight we celebrate what Crestview Medical Center has meant to this community," she began, and her voice carried without strain, projected by training or practice into every corner of the hall. "And the Ashworth Foundation is proud to commit $5 million toward the expansion of emergency care services here." The room applauded. She acknowledged it with a slight nod. "Healthcare is not a luxury. It is the infrastructure of a life worth living, and it deserves to be treated accordingly." Cole listened without moving. He thought about the audit documents he'd seen posted in the administrative corridor 2 weeks ago, the ones that laid out the proposed restructuring of overnight operations. He thought about the line item that read, "Night Emergency Services Review for Consolidation." He thought about what $5 million for expansion meant in the same sentence as consolidation, how those two things could coexist in a single institutional logic if the logic was sufficiently comfortable with its own contradictions. He was still thinking about this when the lights did something they shouldn't. It was not a dramatic failure. One bank of overhead lights along the left wall pulsed, twice stuttered, and went to a lower level. Not out, just diminished, and in the fraction of a second that produced the room's attention fractured. People looked up. Someone near the left wall made a startled sound. A ripple of uncertainty moved through the crowd the way it always did when the reliable systems produced unreliable behavior, when the agreed-upon backdrop of functioning technology hiccuped and reminded everyone that it was in fact operating on their behalf rather than simply existing as a property of the universe. Cole was already scanning. The lighting issue was minor, probably the aging panel system that maintenance had been flagging for 2 years, and it was already stabilizing. But his eyes moved through the crowd with the automatic priority sorting of a man whose training had taught him that a complication was never just itself, that secondary events were where the real problems lived. He saw the man go down. Left side of the room, 12 feet from the stage, in the gap between a cluster of guests who had been listening to the speech and a secondary cluster who had been engaged in the quiet side conversation that happened at every event in the margins of the official proceedings. A man in his early 70s, tuxedo, white hair, the distinguished bearing of someone who had occupied rooms like this for decades, and he went down the way people went down when the body made a unilateral decision. Not a stumble or a trip, a collapse, a withdrawal, every muscle releasing its claim simultaneously. He was on the floor before anyone around him fully registered what had happened. Then someone screamed, and the crowd did what crowds did. Pulled back, opened a circle, produced the instinctive human response to a stranger's catastrophe, which was to create space around it and look for someone else to handle it. Cole was already moving. He was through the crowd in the way he'd always been able to move through crowds, finding the gaps before they fully opened the spatial awareness that had been trained and refined and that operated below the level of conscious decision. He reached the man and went to his knees on the marble floor without breaking momentum. Checked the carotid. Nothing. Tilted the airway, visually confirmed it was clear, pressed his ear close. The chest was not moving. "Someone call 911. Not a request. Not loud, but with the particular quality of an instruction that expected compliance. Tell them cardiac arrest, male approximately 70 years old, Crestview Medical Center main event hall. Tell them now." Behind him, he heard someone's phone already in motion. Good. 30 compressions, the heel of his hand on the lower sternum, 2 inches of depression, 100 beats per minute. The rhythm that lived in his palms, the way a musician's rhythm lived in their hands. 2 breaths. The seal complete the chest rising, back to compressions. He counted in the part of his mind that ran parallel to the part that was monitoring everything else, the man's color, the crowd's distance, the sound of approaching help, the 37 seconds that had passed since the collapse. The brain could tolerate 4 to 6 minutes without oxygen. He was inside that window. They were working. 45 seconds. 60. No response. 75 seconds, and the man made a sound. Not a word, not fully a breath, something between the two, and then a cough that was rough and wet and exactly right. And then the chest was moving on its own, and the color in the face was shifting from the deep cyanotic purple back toward something that was going to be all right. "Sir." Cole put his hand on the man's shoulder, steadying. "Stay still. Help is on the way. You're going to be okay." The man's hand came up and found Cole's wrist, the grip weak but present, the automatic reaching of consciousness reasserting itself. "Don't leave. I'm not going anywhere." The paramedics arrived from the building's medical station at 40 seconds after that, because Crestview was still a functioning hospital, and its event security included medical staff on standby, and they took over with the professional efficiency of transition that Cole knew exactly how to accommodate. He stood. He stepped back. He was already moving toward the wall. And then he stopped because something had him. Not physically. He was not touched. But he had spent enough time in close attention to the presence of people who were looking at him, actually looking, not the ambient social glance of a room full of guests, to know when it was happening. And it was happening now with an intensity that had a specific quality, not curiosity, not the gawking of event guests, processing an unexpected scene, something more focused and more complicated than that. He turned. Diane Ashworth was standing at the edge of the stage. She had not returned to the podium. She was standing very still, in the way that was unusual for someone at a public event, the active stillness of a person who had stopped performing their public self and was doing something private in a public space. Her eyes were on him, not on the paramedics, not on the man being helped onto the stretcher, not on the crowd reorienting itself around the drama of the last 3 minutes. On him. Cole had seen people have recognitions before. He had watched it happen in field conditions where recognitions carried stakes, and the physiological signature was consistent across contexts, the small arrest of motion, the recalibration, the moment where the prior model of the situation encountered something that didn't fit it and had to find a new frame. It was happening in Diane Ashworth's face right now, in the gap between the controlled CEO composure and whatever was underneath it, and the gap was wider than he would have predicted. She knew the way he moved. She knew the specific quality of that stillness under pressure. She had felt the hands. Preston was beside her immediately, too immediately, the movement of a man who had positioned himself to be exactly where he needed to be when this moment arrived, and he leaned close and said something urgent and low. Diane didn't move, didn't turn toward him. Her eyes stayed on Cole across the 20 feet of event space between them. "Wait." The word was not loud. It didn't need to be. It carried. Cole stayed where he was. She came down from the stage carefully because the dress was floor-length and the steps were not designed with floor-length dresses in mind, and she did it without asking for assistance, which was entirely consistent. Preston trailed her at a distance of approximately 2 feet, the orbit of a man who wanted to be included in whatever was about to happen. She stopped in front of Cole, 5 feet away, then 4. Up close, without the distance of the emergency bay or the controlled framing of a press conference, she looked different from both of those contexts. Not smaller, more specific. The composure was still there, but it was doing visible work now, which was different from the version of it he'd seen through the television, which had looked like it cost nothing at all. "I know you," she said, and then, because that wasn't complete, "from the hospital, a month ago." "Yes, ma'am." Her eyes moved over him. Not the way Preston's had that cataloging assessment of what category a person belonged to. Something else, something that was still working toward a conclusion rather than filing what it found. "You were the one who... The medical team handled your care. I was just available." "That's not what I remember." The words were even not accusatory. "I remember your hands. I remember what you said." Cole didn't answer that. There was nothing useful to add to it. Preston stepped slightly forward into the edge of the conversation's space. "Miss Ashworth, we should probably—" And she turned toward him with a look that stopped the sentence cleanly, then turned back. The silence between them lasted a full 5 seconds, which was a long time for silence, and Cole used it to understand that something was happening here that he hadn't prepared for. Not because he hadn't considered the possibility of a second encounter, but because he had assumed the second encounter would go the way the first one had, the clean institutional transaction of a situation managed and a loose end tied off. What was happening instead was something different. She was looking at him the way people looked at things they were trying to remember they'd decided not to think about. Then Preston said her name, not in the completing a sentence way he'd done before, but sharply, urgently, a warning, and it broke something open. Later, Cole would understand that Preston had miscalculated. In trying to pull Diane back into the managed version of the situation, he had instead demonstrated the existence of the managed version in a way that made it impossible to miss. She heard it too. He watched her hear it, but she turned away. The moment closed. The composure reasserted itself with the seamless efficiency of a system that had been doing this work for 15 years. "Thank you," she said to Cole, "for tonight." And then she was moving back toward the stage, toward the event that needed its host to return to it, and Preston fell into step beside her, and Cole watched them go, and then went back to his position by the wall. He was furniture. He was fine with that. He told himself this for the next 3 hours through the remainder of the event and the teardown and the final walk of the building at 1 in the morning, and he was mostly successful. It was 2 days after the gala when Carla found him in the break room at 11:30 at night, and she had the expression of someone who had decided to say something they'd been holding for a while. "She came to HR today. Diane Ashworth. Requested your personnel file." Cole set his coffee down. "When—" "This afternoon. Marianne in records told me she seemed—" Carla paused, choosing. "Specific. About wanting the full file. Everything." He looked at the table surface for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee. "Okay. Okay. That's all you've got. What else should I have?" "Cole." Carla sat down across from him. She had the direct manner of someone who had worked nights in a hospital for 8 years and had run out of patience for the long way around a point. "There are 36 people at this hospital who could get cut in the restructuring. Most of them aren't in her personnel files. Whatever she's looking for it in yours. Maybe she's doing her due diligence. Maybe. Or maybe she's the kind of person who needed to know who handed her life back and is only now getting around to actually finding out." Cole didn't have anything to say to that, which meant it was at least partially true, which meant it made him feel something complicated that he didn't want to feel in the break room at 11:30 at night before 11 more hours of work. He drank his coffee. Carla watched him do this with the expression of a woman exercising considerable restraint. "Just," she said, "keep your phone on. That's all I'm saying." The call came not from Diane, but from Preston, which Cole had not predicted. At 7 the following morning, 4 hours after his shift ended, and 2 hours after he'd fallen asleep, his phone made the sound that his body had been conditioned over years to treat as information requiring immediate processing. He was awake before he was conscious of being awake the way he'd trained himself in places where the time between waking and having your bearings was a variable that mattered. Preston's voice was professional and entirely empty of the previous night's charged atmosphere. He wanted to schedule a brief meeting to discuss Cole's role during Miss Ashworth's emergency admission. Standard HR protocol. Documentation. 45 minutes. Could Cole come in at noon? He went in at noon. The meeting room Preston had booked was a small administrative conference room on the second floor that Cole had walked past several hundred times without entering. A table for 6 with 4 chairs, a window overlooking the parking structure, a whiteboard with the faint ghost of a previous meeting's agenda. Preston was already seated when Cole arrived. He had a folder and a legal pad, and the prepared composure of someone who had already run through this conversation several times in their head. Cole sat down across from him. "I appreciate you coming in." The opening was smooth, the hospitality of a man who wanted you to feel like you'd been invited rather than summoned. "I'll be direct. We're in the process of finalizing the transition documentation, and part of that is making sure we have a complete picture of all staff interactions with Miss Ashworth during her admission. The medical team's documentation would cover that." "Of course. We're being thorough." Preston placed his hands on the table in a way that managed to convey reasonableness. "Your specific involvement that evening, stepping in before the attending physician arrived, it's something we want to note in the record, to make sure it's characterized correctly." Cole looked at him. "Characterized?" "In the context of liability and of the hospital's protocols. There could be questions about whether a non-licensed staff member intervening constitutes a protocol deviation which might have implications for—" "Is she alive?" Preston stopped. "Diane Ashworth. Is she alive?" Cole said it flat, not a question the second time. "Yes, obviously." "Then whatever characterization makes that sentence legally comfortable is fine with me." Cole put his hands on the table unhurried. "Is that what you wanted to document?" Something moved in Preston's expression. Not the calculation that was always running, but a recalibration, the recognition of a different kind of person than he'd walked into the room expecting. He straightened slightly. His hands moved to the folder. He opened it. "There's also the matter of footage from the evening of your interaction." Preston's voice remained even. It was Cole noted a professional skill. "Security camera footage and some personal device footage that was captured during the commotion of Miss Ashworth's arrival." Cole waited. "Miss Ashworth is in a sensitive position given the acquisition timeline. Any narrative that suggests her care was handled in an irregular way, a security guard, rather than medical staff, for instance, could complicate both the business and the, shall we say, personal dimensions of the situation." Preston looked at the folder. She would prefer that the record reflect the medical team's role, which was substantial and highly professional. "She told you that?" The smallest pause. "I represent her interests." Cole looked at the man across the table and thought about the difference between those two sentences. He thought about the phone held up in the emergency bay, the shutter sound, the decision that had been running in the background of Preston's mind since that night. He thought about 30 days of very careful management and about what it looked like when someone managed a situation so carefully that the management itself became the thing that needed managing. "Tell her whatever helps her." Cole stood. "I wasn't planning to tell anyone anything. I'm glad to hear it." Preston reached into the folder and produced a single sheet of paper. "Just as a formality, a confidentiality acknowledgement. Standard in situations where sensitive information—" "No." Preston looked up. "I didn't do anything that needs to be kept quiet," Cole said. "I kept a person alive until the doctor arrived. That's a thing that happened. I'm not going to sign a document saying it didn't happen." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "If you want to fire me over that, you can put it in the restructuring documentation and I'll find something else, but I'm not signing that." He left the conference room. Behind him he heard Preston's chair push back. That evening Diane Ashworth was in a temporary office on the third floor that the hospital had allocated to the acquisition team, and she was alone in it, which was not a normal condition for her at 7 in the evening, but was the one she had arranged for herself after reading Cole's personnel file for the third time. The file was open on the desk in front of her, and the photograph that was attached to it, standard HR photo Cole, in the uniform. The flat, neutral expression of someone who understood that photographs were documents looked back at her with the composure of a man who had learned to give very little away to surfaces. She had read the service record twice before she found the name. It was in the incident report from a 2017 deployment, a forward operating base in a combat zone, the document referred to by designation rather than geography. An ambush, a supply convoy, a medical team that had been separated from the main unit, and a combat medic who had performed field surgeries under fire and then refused evacuation until every surviving soldier had been moved to safety. 23 names on a list. The citation for the Silver Cross ran for a page and a half in the bureaucratic language that military citations used to describe things that the language was not equal to. She found the name halfway down the list of soldiers recovered. Lieutenant James Ashworth. Diane set the file down. She put both hands flat on the desk. The office was quiet the way her offices were always quiet, the particular acoustic isolation of rooms arranged around someone who needed to concentrate, and she sat in that quiet for a long time. She thought about her father's younger brother James, who had been the only member of her family who called her Dee, who had come to her college graduation and taken her to dinner, and said over a meal, neither of them could later remember something that had stayed with her for 20 years. Don't build walls. Diane, build doors. She thought about the hospital room 4 years ago where James had died of a cancer that had taken its time, and about the thing he had said in the last week when the words were still coming clearly about a medic overseas who had not left, who had been there until there was no more there to be. James had not known the man's name. He had described the hands. She picked up the file again and looked at the photograph. The man who had held her hand in an emergency bay and told her she was going to see the sunrise had spent a decade running toward the moments when everyone else ran away, and had then chosen a quiet life not because he had run out of the capacity to move toward those moments, but because his daughter needed a father who came home every morning. And this was it. Turned out the decision that cost him more than the running had ever cost him, because the running had been his purpose, and the quiet was a daily election to set the purpose down for someone smaller and more important than it. She had told him to stay quiet. She had sent Preston to make him sign a document that treated the most clarifying act of her life as a liability to be managed. Diane Ashworth had built a $4 billion company on the principle that good decisions required correct information, and she had spent 30 days operating on information that was not only incomplete, but that she had actively prevented herself from completing because the complete version of it was uncomfortable. This was not a thing she had done before. She was quite certain it was not a thing she would do again. She called Preston. When he answered, she could hear faintly the ambient sound of a restaurant, which meant he was having the kind of dinner that people had when they felt a situation was under control. "The confidentiality document," she said. "Did he sign it?" A brief pause. "No," he declined, "but I think if we approach it differently—" "Delete the document, don't approach it again." Another pause longer. "Diane, the acquisition timeline is in a sensitive—" "Preston." She said his name with the specific weight she used when a conversation was over and the other person had not yet understood that. "Delete the document." She hung up. She sat for another 10 minutes. Then she found a piece of paper in the desk drawer, because there were always legal pads in desk drawers, and she wrote on it by hand, which was something she did only when the formal channels felt inadequate to the actual content of what needed to be communicated. "Cole. I found his name in the file tonight. James Ashworth. I didn't know. I had no idea. And I spent 30 days telling myself I was being practical when the truth is I was just afraid. I'm sorry. Not for the press. For you. Diane." She folded it and found an envelope and addressed it by hand and left it with the night desk staff to be placed in Cole Merritt's staff mailbox. Then she called her personal attorney and spent 45 minutes in a conversation that ended with her attorney saying 3 times in various phrasings that he strongly advised against what she was planning to do in the morning. She thanked him for the advice. It was Carla who found Cole in the break room the next morning and told him to turn on the television. The news coverage had started at 8. Diane Ashworth's press conference had been called with 2 hours' notice and no prepared remarks, which had sent her communications team into the kind of organized panic that communications teams were built to manage, but that they had not in this case been fully consulted about in advance. The reporters in the room could tell they were watching something unscripted. The cameras stayed very still in the way cameras did when they sensed they were in the presence of something that didn't need to be framed, that would carry itself. She stood at the podium without notes. "A month ago, I almost died." The room, which had been running the usual background noise of a press conference setup, went quiet. The person who kept me alive wasn't a surgeon. He wasn't famous. He was a father working a night shift doing a job most people walk past every morning without seeing. She stopped for a moment. His name is Cole Merritt. In the Crestview break room, 2 nurses and an orderly had stopped what they were doing. Someone had turned the volume up. Cole sat at the table with his coffee in both hands and watched the screen. I asked him to stay quiet about what he'd done for me. He did because that's the kind of man he is. But I have not been able to stay quiet. Cole Merritt is a decorated combat medic. He served 3 overseas tours. He saved 23 lives under fire and refused evacuation until every soldier was out. He was awarded the Silver Cross for valor. He came home and chose a life that most people wouldn't have chosen, not because he'd given up on anything, but because his daughter needed a father who came home every morning. That kind of courage doesn't earn headlines. It should. She looked directly into the camera, and for once the composure was not a wall, it was a window, something you could see through into the specific quality of a person deciding to be accountable in public rather than comfortable in private. I was wrong about him. I was wrong about the assumptions I've been making about what matters and what doesn't, about what deserves to be protected and what can be discarded for the sake of a cleaner narrative. And I'm here today because the least I can do given what he did and what I did afterward is say that out loud where it can't be unsaid. In the break room, someone started clapping. Cole looked at the table. He was aware of the people around him in the way he was aware of the field when it was not actively under fire. The peripheral knowledge of presences and positions, attention available but not deployed. He was not going to stand up. He was not going to make a face that anyone would be able to read. From the doorway, a voice he knew better than any other, "Dad." And then he looked up, because he always looked up for that. Lily was standing at the break room door in her school clothes backpack on both shoulders, and she had the expression of someone who had heard enough to understand more than she'd been told. She was 8 years old, and she had been watching him her whole life, and she knew what she was looking at. "She's apologizing," Lily said. "For real this time." Cole looked at the screen. Diane Ashworth stepped back from the podium, and the room went to questions, and in the controlled management of a press environment she bore the weight of it without visible effort, but also now without the quality of insulation that had made her look untouchable. She looked like a person. That was the difference. In the break room the applause had grown. Cole was aware of it the way you were aware of weather as a condition of the environment rather than a thing directed at you. He kept his eyes on his daughter in the doorway. Lily walked over and put her arms around him from behind her chin on his shoulder, the way she'd done since she was small enough that he'd had to lift her to make it work. She didn't say anything else. Neither did he. On the screen, Diane Ashworth was answering a question with the new quality in her voice, the quality of someone who had decided to stop calculating the cost and start paying it. Cole put his hand over Lily's. The coffee had gone cold. The room was loud with something that wasn't quite celebration and wasn't quite relief, more like the sound people made when they had been carrying something and someone had finally confirmed they were right about its weight. The press conference did not end the way press conferences usually ended, with the clean punctuation of a final statement and the dispersal of cameras toward their next assignment. It continued in the way that things continued when they had broken through the surface of what people expected and reached something underneath that had been waiting. The questions ran 40 minutes. Diane answered all of them. She did not deflect, did not pivot to prepared language, did not exercise the practiced art of the non-answer that her communications team had spent years refining into something that sounded like transparency while containing none of it. She simply answered. When a reporter asked whether the acquisition would proceed, she said yes. When another asked whether the restructuring plans would be modified, she said she was reviewing them. When a third asked what she would say to Cole Merritt directly if she could, she paused for the first time in 40 minutes, and the pause was not strategic. "I'd say that I'm sorry I made him carry something that wasn't his to carry, and that I'm going to spend a while trying to deserve the fact that he's still standing." In the break room at Crestview, someone had found the remote and turned the volume up again for that exchange. Cole heard it from his position at the table with Lily's arms still around his shoulders. He didn't react to it in any way that the room could see. What he did quietly and without announcement was make a decision about the envelope in his staff mailbox that he had picked up at 6 that morning and read twice on the walk to his car and carried in his jacket pocket ever since. He would write back. Not immediately, but he would write back. The days after the press conference had the specific texture of aftermath, the period when a thing that has happened is still establishing what it means. The hospital's regular life asserted itself over the disruption, the way water asserted itself over stones flowing around rather than acknowledging. Cole's shifts ran. He signed in, walked the east wing, checked on the occupants of rooms that had changed, and the occupant of room 114, who had not Gerald, now 3 weeks from his last visitor with 2 more weeks of his current treatment cycle remaining, and a son overseas who called on Thursdays. The Ashworth Dynamics consultants were still in the building, still moving through the corridors with their clipboards, but something in their manner had changed the slightly reduced confidence of people whose organizational mandate had become more complicated than it had been when they arrived. Carla found him on the 3rd night after the press conference. She had the look of someone delivering news they weren't sure whether to frame as good or complicated. She called HR again, different request this time. She wants to know if you'd be willing to meet. Cole looked at the corridor ahead of them. Just meet. Just meet. No Preston, no lawyers, no documentation. She said. Carla paused like she was checking the accuracy of her recall. She said it's not a business meeting. She said she owes you a conversation and she'd like to have it if you're willing. He thought about the letter in his pocket, the handwriting on it which had surprised him, not because he'd expected a typed communication, but because the handwriting itself was something he hadn't anticipated, careful, but not controlled the writing of someone who had been paying attention to what they were putting down rather than the appearance of what they were putting down. "Tell her yes," he said. "Tell her I'll be here." She came on a Thursday afternoon, 4 days after the press conference, in the plainest coat she apparently owned, which was still a good coat, but was the kind of good that did not announce itself. No Preston. No assistant of any kind. She came through the main entrance and asked at the desk for him the way anyone would ask for anyone by name, and she waited in the chairs near the reception area until Carla, who had been watching for this, came to find him. He met her in the small family consultation room off the main corridor, a room designed for conversations that required privacy without the formal weight of an administrative space. 2 chairs, a small table, a window onto the interior courtyard where the hospital's one tree stood with the stripped dignity of November, its branches bare and geometrically precise against the pale sky. She was already seated when he came in. She stood when he entered, and then seemed to reconsider the formality of that, and sat back down, and he sat across from her. And for a moment they occupied the room without speaking, which was its own kind of conversation. "I wanted to apologize properly," she said. The composure was present but different in quality from its public versions, less structural, more deliberate. "Not on a stage, not for any reason except that it needed to be said directly to you. You already did, publicly. That was for the world. The world needed to hear it, and I needed to say it where it couldn't be taken back." She looked at the table between them and then at him. "But this is for you. Those are different things." Cole acknowledged the distinction with a slight movement of his head. He had thought in the days since the press conference about what he would say when this conversation happened, and he had found that the thinking produced nothing he wanted to use, which usually meant that thinking was the wrong approach and something else was required. "I know about James," he said. She met his eyes. Whatever she had prepared to say next dissolved. "I didn't know his name when I pulled him out," Cole continued. "I didn't know anyone's name in those moments. Names came later in paperwork and the citations that someone else wrote because I was already at the next thing. I know that sounds—" "No." Her voice was quiet and even. "It sounds exactly like what it was. He talked about you, to your father before he died. I didn't know that until your letter. I didn't know any of the shape of it from his side." Cole looked at the window at the bare tree in the courtyard. "But I knew what it felt like from mine. The ones you got out and the ones you didn't, they don't sort themselves into categories after. They just stay with you, all of them." Diane was looking at him with the particular attention of someone who had decided to actually hear rather than process. It was a different quality of listening than he'd seen in her public mode, which was skilled and thorough, but also managerial, always assessing how the incoming information mapped onto existing structures. This was the other kind, the kind that allowed for things that didn't map. "He told my father the medic who came back for him didn't look scared," she said. "He said that was the thing he remembered most, that you didn't look scared." "I was scared." "I know. That's why it mattered." She paused. "Being brave without fear is just adrenaline. Being scared and going back anyway is something else." Cole considered that for a moment. He thought about the specific quality of fear in a field situation, the way it sharpened certain things and compressed others, the way it was, not the opposite of function, but a feature of it present and acknowledged and then set aside because there was work to do. He thought about the different quality of the fear he'd carried for the past 4 years. The quieter, more domestic variety. The fear of not being enough in the specific small daily ways that fatherhood required, which was harder to set aside because there was no moment of action to absorb it into just the ongoing accumulation of ordinary days. "You grew up learning that everything had a price," he said, not an accusation, an observation offered in the same spirit her words had been offered, that things only meant what they could be traded for. That's not a character flaw, that's what survival looks like when it's the only model you have. She was very still. "When did you stop believing that—" "When Rebecca died and I understood I'd been putting the wrong things in the important column." He said it the way he said things that were true but difficult directly, without the emotional ornamentation that would have made it easier to hear, but also easier to dismiss. "I thought I was calculating right. Tour, come home, tour again, build the career, build the foundation for the life. I had all the columns labeled. I just had them weighted wrong." The room held this for a moment. "I've been doing the same thing," Diane said. It came out like an acknowledgement rather than a confession, the statement of someone who had already done the work of arriving at a conclusion and was now simply reporting it. "Different columns, same error. You're fixing it." "I'm trying to." She looked at the table. "I've never been very good at trying things I might fail at." Cole thought about Lily at the cafeteria table with the mostly done homework, the way she'd sat up straight when she heard him coming, the small performance of competence that was also a small performance of love. He thought about how that habit had a source and about how much of what he had built into his daughter was going to take decades to fully understand. "Nobody is," he said. "The ones who look like they are have just gotten better at not showing the evidence." Diane looked at him then, with something that was not quite a smile, but occupied some of the same space, and Cole recognized it as the expression of someone who had been told an honest thing in a way that allowed it to be received rather than deflected. The conversation lasted another 40 minutes. It wandered in the productive way that conversations wandered when the participants had stopped managing them, through the specifics of James, through Lily, through the shape of what the next months might hold for the acquisition and the hospital, and the role that Diane had proposed through her foundation's program coordinator, a formal offer that had arrived in his staff mailbox 2 days prior. Safety and medical preparedness advisor, part-time, flexible hours. The salary figure had required him to read it twice. "Why this?" he asked, meaning the role, meaning the specific architecture of what she was offering. Not a donation to something, not a public gesture. This. "Because gestures don't require you to stay." She said it with the precision of someone who had thought about the exact words. "And I think you should stay." He looked at her for a moment. She held it, this woman who had been photographed 100 times and had learned to give cameras exactly what she wanted them to have and nothing else, and what she was giving him now was something the cameras had never gotten, the unguarded version, the face of someone who was making an argument they weren't sure they had the right to make. "Lily needs stability," he said. "If this provides it, I'll take it." "Good," she said. And then, because she was who she was, because we also genuinely need you, not as a gesture, as the person who actually knows how to do the thing. He told her he'd review the formal paperwork. She said that was reasonable. They stood at the same moment, the organic ending of a conversation that had completed itself, and she extended her hand, and he shook it, and there was something in that handshake that was both entirely formal and entirely not. The weeks that followed had a different quality from the weeks before. Cole's role at Crestview expanded in the specific organic way of things that had always been present and were simply now being acknowledged. The unofficial knowledge made official, the work that had been done in the margins moved to the center. He attended planning meetings in rooms he had previously only secured the perimeters of. He sat across tables from administrators and medical directors and the remaining members of the Ashworth Dynamics acquisition team, and he spoke when he had something to say and was quiet when he didn't, and what he said was taken seriously in the way that it hadn't been before, not because he had changed, but because the frame around him had. The transition was not without friction. There was a morning meeting in the third week where an associate who had not gotten the updated memo treated him with the elaborate impersonal courtesy that people used for service staff, the looking through rather than looking at, and Cole let it land and filed it and continued with the agenda item he'd been working through. And afterward Diane said quietly in the corridor outside the conference room, "That won't happen again." "It's fine," he said. "It's not. But I appreciate that you don't need me to make it a production." She paused. "Learn the language anyway. Not because the language is right, because you can't change what you're not allowed to stay in the room for." He thought about that for several days. He thought about the difference between compromise and strategy, about how the same action could be either depending on what you kept intact underneath it. He had stayed intact through conditions that this conference room would never produce. The adjustment was not difficult. The adjustment was just the newest version of the work. There was an afternoon in early December when he and Diane were both at the hospital reviewing the floor plans for the proposed community clinic addition, and they had been working for 2 hours in the kind of focused parallel silence that happened between people who had established enough trust to concentrate without performing. Diane had her reading glasses on, which Cole had not seen before, a detail that made her look less like a CEO and more like a person who had to hold things close to read them sometimes. The plans were spread across the conference table, and she was making notes in the margins with a mechanical pencil, the movements efficient and certain. She looked up and found him looking and didn't look away immediately the way she might have done a month ago. "What?" The word was direct but not unfriendly. "You're different here than you are in the other rooms." She considered this. "The other rooms require more armor. This one doesn't." "Apparently not." She returned to the plans. "I'm still deciding how I feel about that." Cole went back to the section he was reviewing. Outside it had started to snow, the first snow of the season arriving in the tentative way of something testing whether it was welcome, thin and pale against the window. He thought about the specific quality of this room and this afternoon and the woman across the table with the reading glasses and the mechanical pencil. And he thought that deciding how he felt about it was probably the wrong frame for it, that some things were better approached as facts to be observed rather than positions to be staked out. He was still thinking about this when his phone buzzed. A text from Lily's school. She had been selected for the after-school health and wellness program that the hospital's pediatric outreach team ran in conjunction with 3 neighborhood schools. She had not mentioned applying. The text from her teacher said she had submitted a short essay about why she wanted to participate, and the teacher had attached it with the note that Cole might want to read it. The essay was 11 sentences. It ended, "My dad says helping people is our family business. I think I want to be in the family business too." He set the phone face down on the table and looked at the window for a moment. Diane, who had peripheral awareness of everything even when focused elsewhere, said nothing, which was the correct thing. The afternoon that changed the remaining shape of the story arrived on a Saturday in late December, in the pocket of time between Christmas and the New Year when the city ran on reduced capacity and the light was low and gold even at noon. Diane was reviewing site plans for the community center that the Ashworth Foundation was funding in conjunction with the hospital, a project that had grown from the initial proposal into something considerably larger, a full-service community health facility offering primary care mental health services and a dedicated program for veterans. Cole had been involved in the design process from the beginning, first as a consultant on the medical preparedness infrastructure, and then gradually in the wider conversations about what the facility needed to be and for whom. He was at the proposed site with Diane and the project architect, a practical woman named Helen, who wore paint-stained boots to site visits and had the rare quality of listening to what clients actually said rather than what she expected them to say. They were standing on the ground floor of what would become the main service area, currently a concrete shell with electrical conduit running the walls and winter light coming through the frameless window openings. Their breath made small clouds. Cole's hands were in his jacket pockets. He heard Lily before he saw her. She had come with him today because it was Saturday, and the alternative was a playdate she had described with sufficient diplomatic resignation that he had concluded it was optional. She had been exploring the upper floor with the methodical enthusiasm of a child who took spaces seriously, and now she came down the temporary construction stairs with something in her hand, a piece of copper wire that she'd found in the debris of the electrical work and fashioned into a rough circle during the time she'd been out of sight. She walked directly to Diane, which she now did without the hesitation of their early acquaintance, and held out the wire circle. "For your wrist," she said, "because you're helping build something." Diane took it. She turned it over in her hands, the uneven handmade thing, and she looked at Lily for a moment with an expression that Cole had been watching develop over the past weeks, the expression of someone learning that receiving things gracefully was its own skill and that it was worth practicing. She slid the wire onto her wrist. "Thank you," she said. And then, "How did you know I needed something on this wrist?" Lily looked at the wrist where the wire now sat above the line of Diane's sleeve. "You always hold that hand still, like you're protecting it." Diane looked at the wrist. "I broke it once," she said. "A long time ago. It healed, but I still—" She stopped. "I still hold it like it's fragile." Lily nodded with the gravity of a child who had just confirmed a hypothesis. "My dad does that with his voice sometimes, when he's talking about Mom." Cole did not look away from the window opening and the street beyond it. Helen made a quiet note on her clipboard that had nothing to do with the building. Diane was looking at Lily with the expression of someone who had just been handed a precise and unexpected truth. "He loves her very much," Diane said. "He loved her," Lily said with the careful grammatical accuracy of an 8-year-old who had thought seriously about tenses. "I think he's making room for the other kind now." The silence that followed this was the particular quality of silence that arrives after a child has said something that the adults in the room would have taken years to approach and might never have gotten to at all. Cole turned from the window. Lily was looking at him with the expression that was her mother's, the one that had learned apparently across the span of her short life how to hold someone visible and allow for the discomfort of that. He looked at his daughter and thought about the 11-sentence essay and about the copper wire on Diane's wrist, and about the way the story of a person was never the story they would have chosen to tell about themselves, never the clean version with the sensible arc, always the actual one, full of the choices that cost something, and the waiting rooms and the night shifts and the small handmade things. He looked at Diane. She was looking back at him across the concrete shell of a building that was going to become something that people would need, and she had the wire on her wrist, and her hands were no longer held in the managed stillness of someone protecting a surface, but in the open, unrehearsed position of someone who had set something down. "Lily," he said, "go see if Helen needs any help with the measurements." Lily considered whether to be insulted by this transparent maneuver, decided against it, and went to find Helen, who was experienced enough to take a child's assistance seriously, and did. Cole and Diane were alone in the main room with the winter light coming through the frameless windows and their breath in the cold air and the background sounds of the building site. "She's right," Diane said. It came out without the layering he'd come to associate with statements she'd prepared, just the fact of it. "She usually is." He looked at the window again, then back. "She gets that from her mother." What do you get from her mother? He thought about this. Rebecca had been a woman who approached problems directly and without complaint, who laughed at things that were actually funny, who had a talent for the specific correct word in the specific correct moment that had made her both easy and impossible to argue with. The ability to recognize when something's real, he said, even when it's inconvenient. Diane held his eyes. Is this real? Yes, he said. I think it is. The conversation that followed was not the conversation of two people who had just made a declaration and needed to process it. It was the conversation of two people who had already been in the process of something for weeks and were simply naming it, which was different and in some ways required more honesty, because the naming made it solid, and the solid version could be held and examined and turned in the light. They talked for 40 minutes in the concrete shell, while Helen took her measurements and Lily helped with professional seriousness, and they talked about what the next year might look like, and what they were each afraid of, and what they were not willing to compromise on the substantive negotiations of two people who had both been through enough to know that the beginning of things was when the important conversations happened, not after. Diane was direct about her fears in the way she was direct about everything once she had decided to stop using the armor. Cole was direct in the way he was always direct without the armor, because he had never found it useful, because in the fields where he had learned to be a person, there had been no time for it. They were not the same kind of person. This was apparent. The ways they moved through rooms and decisions and silences were different in ways that would require ongoing translation, and both of them were sufficiently clear-eyed to understand this, rather than perform a version of compatibility that would have been more comfortable and less durable. But underneath the different approaches was something that had been present since an emergency bay in November, something that had survived the first bad choice, and the 30 days of managed silence, and the corridor encounter with its cold formality, something that had been tested in the specific way that things were tested when the circumstances around them were difficult, which was the most reliable kind of testing there was. The grand opening of Ward Center for Community Healing arrived on a February morning that was cold in the specific way that February mornings in the city were cold. Not the dramatic cold of a weather event, but the steady bone-level cold of a season that had been doing its work for months and was not yet finished. The building had been transformed. Cole had watched the transformation in stages across the preceding weeks. The concrete shell given warmth and purpose, the service areas configured with the input of people who would use them, the veteran support wing arranged with the input of veterans rather than administrators, which produced a different kind of space than the one the architects had initially proposed. The crowd on the lawn was larger than anyone had planned for. Veterans stood in groups with the particular quality of proximity that came from shared experience, comfortable in silence with each other in a way they were rarely comfortable in silence with civilians. Families occupied the space around them, children running the geometry of the lawn with the energy of people who had been contained too long. Medical staff neighbors, city officials who had heard about the project and wanted to be associated with it, the usual complex attendance of something that had become visible. Cole was at the back of the crowd. Diane was at the podium, and she was good at this, now in a way she had not been when he first watched her on a small television in a hospital break room, good in the way of someone who had stopped performing it and started simply doing it, the difference between expertise and presence. She spoke for 8 minutes without notes. She talked about the building and what it was for and what it had taken to build it, and she talked about the people who had made it possible. And then she stopped in the middle of a sentence and looked to the back of the crowd and said, "Cole Merritt, come up here." He shook his head. Immediately from his left, Lily's hand in his arm, pulling without negotiation. "Dad, go. They need to hear you." "I don't have anything prepared." "I know." She pushed him. She was 8 years old and she weighed 63 pounds, and she moved him with the authority of someone who had decided this was happening. "That's why it'll be real." He walked to the front. The crowd parted, the way crowds parted for him. He had never understood why this was the particular quality of attention he generated when he moved through a space, but he had stopped trying to prevent it. He stood at the microphone, looked at the faces in front of him. Veterans who had been through things he understood without being told. Families who were there because someone they loved had come home changed. medical workers who had chosen the work he had come to understand as the organizing principle of his own life. He looked at Lily in the front of the crowd, the copper wire bracelet Diane had given her months ago on her wrist, her eyes up and steady and uncomplicated with pride in the way that only the people who loved you clearly could look at you. He looked at Diane beside the podium, the wire from the construction site still on her wrist, a more impermanent thing than the bracelet, but present. "I'm better with heartbeats than microphones." The crowd made the quiet sound of recognition. He waited for it to settle. "But here's what I know. Healing isn't just for the wounded. It's for everyone who still cares enough to try." He looked at the veterans, at the families, at the building behind him, its windows lit from the inside with the particular warm quality of a space that was ready to be used. "We all carry something, every person standing here. The question isn't what we carry, it's what we do with it, whether we build walls to put it behind or something the rest of us can walk through." He stopped. "Let that sit. I chose to build something you could walk through. I hope you will too." Lily ran onto the stage before the applause had properly started. She had the drawing in her hand, the one from the cafeteria table in November, the ballpoint pen figures she had worked on in the margins of a math workbook at 2 a.m. while her father walked the corridors of a building being assessed for its profitability. She held it up, and then, because she was Lily and she had made a decision, she walked directly to Diane and put it in her hands. Diane looked at the drawing, the two figures, the thing between them that was a heart drawn by a child who had decided to make it explicit, written below in the careful printing of someone who knew the words, "Mattered dad giving jacket to lady, heart shining." Diane's throat moved. She looked at Lily and then at Cole. And Cole watched the thing that had been building in her across these months arrive at its completion, the woman who had built every room of her life as a controlled space, finding herself in an uncontrolled one and discovering that she had been wrong about what that would feel like. She reached into the pocket of her coat and produced the box that Cole had not known she was carrying, a small thing in dark wood, and she opened it and held it out. Inside was a medal, simple, well-made, the weight of something intended to last. He picked it up and turned it over. On the front, Crestview Medical Center, and a date. On the back, in clean engraved letters, "Please don't make it fast. Stay." He held it for a moment, the specific physical weight of it, the deliberateness of the inscription that had taken the words from the worst night of her life and made them into something she could give. Diane stepped forward and took it from his hand and pinned it to his jacket herself. Her hand steady the wire loop of a construction site remnant visible at her wrist just below the cuff, the impermanent thing she had kept because Lily had given it to her and because some things did not require permanence to matter. "You told me I was going to see the sunrise," she said low enough that it was for him rather than the crowd. "I have seen so many of them since that night. Every single one felt like something I owed you." He looked at her. The composure was present, genuinely present, but it was the composure of someone who had arrived at something rather than someone who was holding something at bay. The difference was visible to anyone paying attention, and Cole had been paying attention since November. "You don't owe me sunrises," he said. "No." She met his eyes. "I owe you the truth, which is that I'm a different person than I was, and that's partly because you were there when I had decided to stop fighting." She stopped, started again. "Don't disappear. I know that's your instinct. To do the thing and step back and let the building take over. But the world needs you visible. And—" the composure made its small adjustment, the one he'd learned to read as the thing underneath pressing against the surface. "I need you visible." Cole looked at the medal on his jacket, then at the crowd, then at Lily in the front row with her chin up and her eyes wet with a happiness she wasn't trying to conceal. He thought about the night in November and the water for Gerald and the drives home with the radio off and the years of making himself small enough to fit inside the life that was available rather than the life he'd been trained for. He thought about Rebecca, who would have had a specific word for this moment, the right one, and who he could no longer ask. He thought about what it meant to stay. "Guess some pain is worth feeling," he said softly to Diane specifically. Her expression did the thing it did now, sometimes the thing that was new, the thing that required no armor to produce and no effort to read. "Yeah," she said, "it really is." The applause came up from the crowd in the way. Applause came up when it was not responding to a cue, but to something it had been moved by and needed to express, and it was loud, and it lasted. And Cole stood in it, the way he stood in everything present, grounded, not quite comfortable, but no longer trying to escape the discomfort which was its own kind of progress. Lily was there in 6 steps, her arms around his waist, her face against his jacket, the metal cool against her cheek. The drawing was still in Diane's hands. Behind them, through the new windows of Ward Center, the light was on in every room, steady and warm, the light of a building that knew its purpose and was ready to begin. 6 months moved through the way, months moved when the life inside them was full, not with the painless motion of things going right, but with the daily weight of things requiring attention and effort and the occasional recalibration. Cole's office at Ward Center was small and accumulated the evidence of its occupant, Lily's drawings in a row above the window, a whiteboard with protocols in his handwriting, a first aid kit on the shelf that was stocked to a standard several levels above what the space technically required. He was there before the facility opened each morning and present through the irregular hours that the work generated, which were not the predictable hours of a security shift, but the more demanding hours of work that had no official end. Lily turned 9 in March. She was now formally enrolled in the Youth Health Education Program and had developed with the organic certainty of someone who has found their direction a focused interest in emergency response that her instructors described in their progress reports with words like exceptional and initiative, and please let us know what she eats for breakfast. Cole read these reports with the expression of a man in the presence of something too large to be addressed directly. Diane did not move into his life. She moved alongside it, which was different and more sustainable and required more ongoing negotiation and produced a better result. She learned slowly and with the occasional setback that she handled with growing equanimity, that being in a family that included an opinionated 9-year-old with a copper wire bracelet and opinions about emergency protocols was different from being in a management structure, and that the difference was not a deficit. Cole learned with less difficulty but equivalent attention that being with someone who processed the world in the language of systems and structures was not a thing to resist, but a thing to translate across the way he'd always translated across the gaps between what he knew and what the situation required. Carla caught them once early on a Tuesday morning in the external corridor of Ward Center, both of them with coffee watching the street come to life in the gray light before the facility opened. They weren't talking. They were standing in the particular close silence of people who had moved past the need to fill the space between them. Carla looked at this for a moment, then went back inside, and she told no one, and the story stayed its own for a while longer. Gerald was discharged from Crestview in April with a treatment plan that his daughter in Phoenix had finally arrived to help him manage. He sent a card to the security desk care of Cole Merritt, which reached him through 3 sets of forwarding hands and arrived on his desk at Ward Center 3 weeks after it was written. Inside, in the careful handwriting of a man who had learned penmanship in a different era, "You were there every night. I noticed. Thank you for noticing back." Cole read it twice, placed it in the drawer beside the letter from November and the photograph of Rebecca and the things he kept, because they were the actual record of the life, not the version that could be explained to someone in a hallway. The acquisition of Crestview finalized in April with a restructuring package that contained in its final form a provision that Diane's legal team had argued against, and that she had retained regardless no support staff reductions in the first 24 months without independent community impact review. It was not a dramatic provision. It was not the kind of thing that generated a press conference. It was the kind of thing that changed what happened to people who brought water to patients at 2 in the morning, and it would continue to change that quietly and without recognition, which was, Cole thought, when he read it, exactly the correct way for the right things to work. Lily put the Ward Center's newest edition on the wall of her room the following week, A photograph taken by Helen the architect on the day of the opening of Cole at the microphone, looking at the crowd and in the foreground, slightly unfocused but present. Diane's face turned toward him with the expression that was new and real and not armor in any of its forms. Lily added a label below it in her printing, "Dad staying." It was the most precise thing anyone had said about any of it. Outside, in the particular quality of a spring morning that arrived with the patient certainty of things that came back regardless of what the winter had been, the city was in the process of continuing. The building was open. The light was on. The work was there to be done, and the people who were there to do it were present, which was the oldest and most durable form of any answer worth giving.